The Cold War. In 1945, World War II finally decided to call it quits, with the embarrassing collapse of the Axis powers. Europe was a wreck, looking no different than a giant scrapyard. The old big shots like Britain and France suddenly lost all their clout and influence, as if two old geezers just had their tough guy on the block titles revoked. Meanwhile, two new characters emerged as world superpowers: the US, representing glamorous capitalism, and the Soviet Union, representing mysterious communism. Sadly, these two dudes held political ideologies as opposite as fire and water, or like cash versus communal property. It was this who's right, who's wrong conflict that kicked off a tense historical period known by the lovely name, the Cold War. After the Yalta Conference in February 1945, to reorganize the world after the war, which really meant carving up the spoils, the parties discussed and decided to turn Europe into a cake split in two, with two blocs bearing two different social systems. The Western Bloc, representing traditional capitalism, ran its economy through the so-called right to private ownership of property and means of production, where a free business environment was enthusiastically promoted, but created a stark division between rich and poor, naturally, because capitalists were legally allowed to exploit workers' labor to maximize profits, a terrifyingly efficient business model. Conversely, the Eastern Bloc, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, represented socialism, or communism, operating its economy based on public ownership. They advocated for eliminating the exploitation by the bourgeois class and aimed for an equal society. Everyone equally poor? Oh wait, no. People work according to their ability and receive according to their needs. A very difficult ideal to implement. Poor Germany was carved up like a turkey into 4 occupation zones. West Germany belonged to the Allied forces of Britain, France, and the US, while East Germany belonged to the Soviet Red Army. The capital, Berlin, was split in two by the so-called Berlin Wall in July 1948. A bizarre architectural work meant to stop people from getting lost and ending up on the capitalist side. Things got more serious when the US, Britain, and France merged their 3 occupation zones to establish the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, declaring it would follow the capitalist path. The Soviet Union responded immediately by establishing the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, which loyally followed the socialist path and instantly became a satellite state, also known as the Soviet Union's new best friend. In a seemingly well-intentioned effort, on April 25, 1945, in San Francisco, USA, along with 50 other nations, the United Nations, UN, was established, one of the largest and most important organizations with the noble goal of maintaining world peace, security, and promoting cooperative relations between countries, a near impossible task to this day. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was born, officially marking the beginning of the Cold War. According to it, the U.S. declared it would provide financial and military aid to any country it suspected was being threatened by communism. A very effective political marketing ploy. The all-out economic war officially began. The U.S. deployed the Marshall Plan, pouring $17 billion, a colossal sum, to rebuild Western Europe and prevent the spread of communism, also known as buying loyalty. Furthermore, anti-communist propaganda campaigns were plastered across all media. In response, the Soviet Union, not to be outdone, actively spread anti-capitalist propaganda and established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, an economic alliance among the socialist countries in Eastern Europe, sort of a let's all save ourselves together club. Besides the economic battlefield, the two superpowers also competed fiercely in many other fields, especially science, technology, space, and the military. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb, breaking the U.S. monopoly on nuclear technology, a huge shock to the Pentagon. That same year, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed, based on the treaty signed between the U.S. and Western European countries to counter the growing threat of the Soviet Union. To deal with NATO, the Soviet Union also established its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955, an extremely expensive armed standoff. Throughout the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union never once declared war directly on each other. A wise decision, fearing the world would be blown to bits. Instead, they did something more cunning. They supplied weapons and money to their allies to fight their opponents' allies. This was the proxy war tactic, making other people do their fighting. Greece can be seen as the first proxy war location. The Greek Communist Party, supported by the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, began a civil war against the Greek national government, which was supported by Britain and the US. The war lasted 3 years, until Yugoslavia suddenly had a falling out with the Soviet Union and stopped its aid to the communist side. The result? The Greek National Army won. The Western Bloc breathed a temporary sigh of relief. In Asia, China was also in the midst of a civil war between the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, and the Communist Party. Although the Nationalists had a much larger army, their ranks were rife with internal squabbling. Their soldiers were exhausted after World War II, and the economy was suffering from hyperinflation due to corruption. A perfect recipe for failure. After 3 years of war, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, with the support of the people, won a resounding victory. They took control of mainland China and established the People's Republic of China. The Nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were defeated and forced to flee to Taiwan. This victory connected the socialist system from Europe to Asia, a huge boost for the communist side. Riding high on this political victory, the Soviet Union proceeded to aid North Korea, which boldly launched an all-out invasion of the South. The North Korean army attacked like a hurricane, pushing the South Korean army to the coast. The United Nations quickly formed an emergency force, mostly American, with troops from 16 countries to intervene. The Allied forces counterattacked and pushed the North Korean army to the northern border, which made China feel threatened. Kind of like, my neighbor is about to jump my fence. So it jumped into the fray, citing national security. Over 1.9 million Chinese troops flooded across the border, coordinating with the North Korean army to launch a ferocious counterattack using the human wave tactic, successfully pushing back the South Korean and Western forces. When the two sides had torn each other apart all the way to the 38th parallel, they reached a stalemate. The war only ended with an armistice agreement in 1953, a war with no winner and no loser. After the Korean War, the U.S. aided France in its attempt to recolonize its territories in Indochina, including Vietnam. A not-so-wise choice. In 1954, the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with support from the Soviet Union and China, resisted fiercely and successfully defeated the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, forcing France to the negotiating table to sign the Geneva Accords. France subsequently withdrew from its Indo-Chinese colonies. To prevent the spread of communism in Indochina, the U.S. quickly established the Republic of Vietnam regime in the south, confronting the communist regime in the north, separated by the 17th parallel. In 1956, using the excuse that Egypt had nationalized the Suez Canal, a joint force of Britain, France, and Israel launched an attack on Egyptian territory. They were quite successful in occupying the Suez Canal, but the Soviet Union threatened to use nuclear weapons to support Egypt, a serious power move. This made the US fear a new world war was imminent. The US threatened to sanction Britain and Ireland and cut off oil supplies to Britain if the joint forces didn't withdraw from Egypt. Relations between Britain, France, and the US were severely damaged after this event. Britain and France realized they had truly lost their top dog status. On October 4, 1957, the whole world was stunned when the Soviet Union successfully launched the first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit, Sputnik. To regain the upper hand in science and technology, the US introduced educational reforms, established NASA, and later succeeded in putting the first man on the moon, kicking off a very expensive space race. In Latin America, the US established a backyard system for itself, ensuring there would be no place for communism there. However, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution succeeded, and a communist government was established. A slap in the face to the US. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, recruited anti-communist Cuban exiles to carry out the Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow the Cuban government, but it failed miserably. The CIA also deployed nearly 638 assassination plots against Cuban leader Fidel Castro, all of which failed. A record-breaking level of failure. The Soviet Union, upon hearing the news, immediately sent troops and warships to Cuba, deploying medium-range missiles aimed straight at the US. Tensions reached a boiling point as the navies of both sides were ready to declare war. Everyone held their breath, waiting for a World War III. But through negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw all missiles from Cuba. In return, the US had to promise not to invade Cuba again and had to withdraw all its missiles from Italy and Turkey. A secret little trade-off. Returning to Vietnam, the government of the South refused to recognize the Geneva Accords and refused to hold a general election to reunify the country. At the same time, they implemented extreme anti-communist policies, leading the North to establish the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam and launch an all-out offensive using guerrilla tactics, with support from the Soviet Union and China. The two sides fought fiercely, and the war grew more brutal. The US spent hundreds of billions of dollars on this war, and it became one of the most expensive wars in history. Right in the US, the anti-war movement among the populace swelled, and public opinion grew increasingly harsh. Realizing the war was not going as expected, the US decided to withdraw its troops in 1973. 2 years later, the communist side won, and Vietnam was reunified. A bitter end for the US. After the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union seized the opportunity to gain political influence in Africa by funding communist organizations and movements there. On another front, the Soviet Union poured troops into Afghanistan to support the communist government against the Mujahideen rebels, an Islamic organization financed by the West. The Chinese government viewed the Soviet intervention as an act of aggression that threatened its western border. Therefore, China entered a temporary alliance with the US to jointly fund the resistance forces fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. In Europe, France had stormed out of NATO due to disagreements with the US. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, upgraded its missile systems and aimed them directly at Western Europe, forcing the US to install more missiles in response, creating a missile race in Europe. In short, everyone had to be tense. The Cold War was now leaving both superpowers mutually wounded. At this time, In Central America, a former agent recruited by the CIA to fight communism in Panama, Manuel Noriega, had now become an anti-American dictator. He turned Panama into a center for money laundering and drug trafficking to the US and Europe, a classic betrayal. Using the excuse of protecting democracy and human rights, and more importantly, getting the canal back, the US launched a major invasion of Panama with 27,000 troops, plunging the entire city into a sea of fire. The result: Noriega was overthrown and extradited to the US to serve a 30-year prison sentence, and most importantly, the US regained control of the Panama Canal. This invasion was strongly condemned internationally, but it had no effect because by this time, the Soviet Union was too weak. Due to a lack of funds to maintain its enormous military budgets, the Soviet Union began to run out of money and decided to stop funding communist movements in Africa and withdraw all troops from Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan was also likened to the Soviet Union's own Vietnam War. It had cost thousands of lives and hundreds of millions of dollars, significantly draining the military strength and economy of the Soviet Union. By 1990, the Soviet alliance system was on the verge of collapse as communist leaders within the Warsaw Pact gradually lost power. Reforms and elections spread throughout Eastern Europe. The hateful Berlin Wall was torn down, and Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union attempted economic reforms and opening up, but all failed. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and was split into 15 independent republics, leading to the collapse of the socialist system in Eastern Europe, along with the dissolution of the Warsaw Military Bloc and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON. This marked the end of the bipolar order and the Cold War. The US became the sole superpower in the world, the last one standing. NATO continued to exist, expand, and stand ready to intervene in regions beyond its member states' borders. This organization really likes to expand. During the Cold War, the national liberation movements of colonized countries grew stronger and spread throughout the world. From the end of the 20th century into the 21st century, the majority of nations around the world had gained independence after so many years. The rise of China, Japan, and many Western European countries created new economic centers to counterbalance the US and change the global economic balance. The scientific and technological revolution has spurred globalization, increasing the need for international cooperation. The trend of peace, cooperation, and mutual development became the general global trend, although there are still a few minor incidents from time to time. Thanks for watching.